Behind the barbed wires of Rikers Island lies a place more terrifying than any nightmare. This isn't a prison, it's a war zone where survival is a daily battle. Men cry out for help, but no one hears them. Corruption, violence, and broken spirits fill every corner. What you're about to hear is not just a story. It's a warning, a cry for justice. And it's time the world opened its eyes. Rikers Island isn't just a prison, it's a mirror reflecting the darkest cracks in America's justice system. For decades, this massive jail complex in New York City has been infamous for violence, abuse, and neglect. Inmates held without trial. Teenagers locked in with murderers. People suffering mental illness left untreated. Rikers has become a symbol, not of justice, but of failure. But behind every headline, every scandal, there are real human lives. Men and women caught in a system that forgets them. People like Kalief Browder, who spent 3 years in Rikers, 2 in solitary, for a crime he didn't commit. The trauma drove him to take his own life. His story shook the nation, but how many more are we not hearing? This speech is not about statistics. It's about truth. About a place where the strong prey on the weak, where correctional officers turn a blind eye, and where the word rehabilitation has no meaning. It's a place where people go in, but many never come out the same. Today, I challenge you not to look away. If we truly want change, we must first confront the hell we've allowed to exist in our own backyard. Because no one, no matter what they've done, deserves to live in fear, stripped of dignity and humanity. Rikers Island is a living hell. And silence keeps it alive. Rikers is a symbol of systemic failure. It represents not just crime, but the collapse of justice, rehabilitation, and human rights in the U.S. penal system. High population of pretrial detainees. Most inmates at Rikers haven't been convicted, they're simply awaiting trial. Some wait months, even years, for a court date. Extreme violence and inmate abuse. Daily assaults, riots, and stabbings are common. Inmates often suffer more from guard brutality than from other prisoners. Solitary confinement is rampant. Even minors and mentally ill prisoners are held in isolation for weeks or months, causing permanent psychological damage. Kalief Browder's tragic story. A 16-year-old boy accused of stealing a backpack endured years in Rikers with no conviction. His story exemplifies everything wrong with the system. Staff corruption and negligence. Corruption among correctional officers and lack of proper training creates a toxic, lawless environment behind bars. Mental health crisis inside Rikers. Inmates with mental illness are often ignored or mistreated. Suicide attempts are frequent. There's no healing, only survival. Calls for reform and closure. Advocates, former inmates, and even government leaders are pushing to shut down Rikers and replace it with safer, community-based alternatives. 1. Rikers is a symbol of systemic failure, expanded. Rikers Island is not just another prison facility. It is the living, breathing embodiment of how broken the American justice system truly is. Stretching over 400 acres, it stands not as a place of correction or reform, but as a warehouse for human suffering. It's where the poor, the marginalized, and the voiceless are dumped, often before they've even had a fair trial. Decades of reports, investigations, and eyewitness testimonies have painted a chilling picture of what happens behind its locked gates. Unchecked violence, lack of medical care, corrupt staff, and inhumane living conditions. What makes Rikers uniquely disturbing is how it operates as a reflection of societal inequality. The majority of its inmates are Black and Latino, and many are incarcerated simply because they cannot afford bail. This isn't about justice, it's about poverty, race, and a deeply embedded culture of punishment over rehabilitation. Rikers is a place where time slows, where human dignity is stripped away piece by piece, and where the idea of a second chance is almost laughable. It has become a forgotten island, physically isolated and morally abandoned. Generations of officials have promised reform, yet the same abuses continue unchecked. The public hears about scandals and lawsuits, but little changes inside those walls. Rikers exists in the shadows of New York City, surrounded by water but drowning in silence. The very existence of a place like Rikers. 2. High population of pretrial detainees, expanded. One of the most disturbing truths about Rikers Island is that the majority of the people locked inside its walls haven't even been convicted of a crime. They are pretrial detainees, Individuals who are legally presumed innocent but are forced to endure the same harsh, violent, and degrading conditions as convicted criminals. Many are arrested for minor, non-violent offenses like petty theft, drug possession, or even traffic violations. Yet they remain imprisoned for weeks, months, or even years, simply because they can't afford bail. This creates a devastating cycle of injustice, where freedom is not determined by guilt or innocence, but by wealth. If you're poor, you stay. If you have money, you walk free, regardless of the crime. The bail system disproportionately punishes low-income individuals, many of whom lose their jobs, homes, and even custody of their children just because they were unable to post bond. Families are torn apart not by a verdict, but by a dollar amount. Inside Rikers, these pre-trial detainees are thrown into the same overcrowded units as violent offenders. They are exposed to the same dangers, the same threats, and the same brutal treatment from both inmates and correctional staff. The trauma begins before they've had a chance to defend themselves in court. Young men, teenagers even, enter the facility and are immediately forced into survival mode, learning to fight, to shut down emotionally, and to distrust everyone around them. Innocence doesn't protect them. The system doesn't protect them. And with every passing day, they lose a little more of who they were before they walked in. 3. Extreme violence and inmate abuse, expanded. Rikers Island has become synonymous with unchecked violence, a place where brutality is not just a risk, but an expectation. From the moment an inmate steps foot inside, they are plunged into an atmosphere charged with fear, aggression, and survival instinct. Fights erupt daily over food, clothing, or simply occupying the wrong space at the wrong time. Inmates live with the constant anxiety of being attacked, extorted, or humiliated, sometimes by their peers, but often by the very people sworn to protect them. Correctional officers at Rikers have developed a notorious reputation for excessive force and physical abuse. Instead of de-escalating tensions, many are reported to provoke or even participate in violent encounters. Some officers operate under a toxic code of silence, where misconduct is ignored, hidden, or even encouraged by supervisors. In multiple documented cases, guards have been caught organizing so-called fight clubs, where they pit inmates against each other for entertainment or as punishment. Beatings by staff are not isolated incidents. They are part of a pattern. What's even more horrifying is how often this violence is targeted toward the vulnerable. Those with mental illnesses, physical disabilities, or first-time offenders are frequently the easiest victims. They are bullied, harassed, and abused with little to no recourse. Surveillance footage goes missing. Reports are buried. Medical care is delayed or denied outright. It's a brutal system that doesn't correct, it crushes. And within this environment, violence becomes not only common, but routine. It becomes part of the culture. A language everyone must learn in order to survive. 4. Solitary confinement is rampant, expanded. One of the most psychologically damaging practices within Rikers Island is the widespread and often indiscriminate use of solitary confinement. Known as the box or punitive segregation, solitary confinement is supposed to be a last resort disciplinary tool, but at Rikers, it has become a routine form of control. Inmates, including minors and those suffering from mental illness, can be locked alone in tiny windowless cells for 23 hours a day, sometimes for weeks, months, or even years at a time. No human contact, no fresh air, no meaningful stimulation, just a cement box and the crushing weight of silence. Studies have shown that prolonged isolation can cause severe psychological harm. Hallucinations, paranoia, anxiety, depression, and even suicidal thoughts. Yet despite this overwhelming evidence, Rikers continues to rely on solitary confinement, not just for violent behavior, but for infractions as minor as talking back to an officer or possessing an extra blanket. For many inmates, solitary is not a punishment for misconduct. It's a tool of control, intimidation, and retaliation. Young people, especially teenagers, are particularly vulnerable. Imagine a 16-year-old locked away with no human contact, no education, no rehabilitation services, just walls. The damage inflicted in these cells often lasts long after release. Some inmates leave solitary with symptoms of PTSD, their minds permanently altered by the experience. Others never make it out at all, turning to self-harm or suicide as the only perceived escape from their torment. The use of isolation at Rikers has sparked lawsuits, protests, and reform pledges over the years, but in reality, little has changed on the ground. 5. Kalief Browder's tragic story, expanded. Among the countless stories of suffering that have emerged from Rikers Island, none has captured the nation's conscience more powerfully than that of Kalief Browder. At just 16 years old, Kalief was arrested in the Bronx on suspicion of stealing a backpack, an accusation with no physical evidence, no witness statements, and no firm legal footing. Yet despite the flimsy nature of the charge, Kalief was sent to Rikers Island to await trial. What followed was not justice. It was a brutal descent into trauma that ultimately led to the loss of a promising young life. Kalief spent over 1,000 days behind bars, more than 700 of those in solitary confinement. He was never convicted of a crime. He was never given a trial. His family couldn't afford the $3,000 bail required for his release, and so the system effectively buried him alive in one of the most violent facilities in America. Inside Rikers, he endured beatings by both inmates and correctional officers, starvation, psychological torture, and complete isolation. He tried to maintain his innocence, refusing plea deals because he believed the truth would eventually set him free. Instead, the system wore him down. His mental health deteriorated rapidly as he cycled in and out of solitary, his voice ignored by a bureaucracy that didn't care. When he was finally released, after 3 harrowing years, the damage was irreversible. Kalief tried to rebuild his life, but the trauma followed him. Depression, paranoia, and suicidal thoughts plagued his every step. In 2015, at the age of 22, Kalief took his own life, hanging himself with an air conditioner cord at his mother's home in the Bronx. His death sent shockwaves across the country and exposed the brutal reality of pre-trial detention, solitary confinement, and systemic negligence. Kalief wasn't a criminal. He was a kid. A student. A son. A human being lost in a system that failed him at every level. 6. Staff corruption and negligence, expanded. At the heart of Rikers Island's dysfunction lies a deeply rooted culture of staff corruption, negligence, and abuse of power. Correctional officers, many of whom are overworked and poorly trained, are not just passive observers of the chaos. They are often active participants. While the job of a correctional officer is to maintain order and ensure safety, countless reports and investigations have revealed a disturbing reality. At Rikers, the keepers frequently become the tormentors. Numerous whistleblowers and former inmates have described a system where officers regularly turn a blind eye to violence or, worse, orchestrate it. There have been documented cases where guards intentionally pitted inmates against one another, placing individuals with known conflicts into the same housing units to incite fights. These actions are not just cruel, they're calculated. Some officers have even operated under a kind of unspoken fight club mentality, betting on outcomes or using violence as entertainment or punishment. Negligence is just as rampant. Inmates often go hours or even days without access to medical care, even in life-threatening situations. Emergency call buttons are ignored. Injuries are shrugged off. Those who file complaints or report mistreatment are labeled troublemakers, often facing retaliation such as beatings, verbal threats, or being transferred into more dangerous housing areas. And while there are supposed to be systems in place to investigate abuse, such as internal affairs units and oversight boards, many of these processes are either underfunded, politically influenced, or simply ineffective. This toxic environment affects everyone, including newer staff who may enter the job with good intentions but are quickly absorbed into a culture that values intimidation over integrity. Veteran officers sometimes enforce a code of silence, pressuring others not to report misconduct or to falsify official reports. As a result, transparency becomes nearly impossible, and accountability remains rare. Ask ChatGPT. Ask ChatGPT. Ask ChatGPT. 7. Mental health crisis inside Rikers, expanded. Rikers Island is not equipped to be a mental health facility, yet it has become one of the largest de facto psychiatric institutions in the United States. A staggering percentage of the incarcerated population at Rikers suffers from mental illness, ranging from anxiety and depression to severe disorders like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Many of these individuals were arrested not because they posed a real threat to public safety, but because they displayed symptoms of untreated or poorly managed conditions in public spaces. Instead of receiving help, they were handcuffed, processed, and thrown into a system that only deepens their suffering. Once inside Rikers, the conditions these individuals face are often nothing short of psychological torture. There's a critical shortage of trained mental health professionals, and even when services are technically available, they are inconsistent, rushed, and under-resourced. Inmates in psychiatric distress are often placed in solitary confinement, a practice that only exacerbates their condition. Isolation, sensory deprivation, and the constant threat of violence turn mental health issues into full-blown crises. In some cases, instead of being treated with compassion, these inmates are restrained, beaten, or ignored entirely. Many of them deteriorate rapidly in this environment, losing touch with reality, becoming suicidal, or lashing out in desperation, only to face further punishment. Suicide attempts are tragically common, and some of the most heartbreaking deaths at Rikers have involved individuals who begged for help and received none. The facility lacks not only adequate treatment plans, but also any sense of long-term care or follow-up. Medications are frequently denied or distributed incorrectly, therapy is rare, and emergency responses are alarmingly slow. Even those who arrive at Rikers without a diagnosed mental illness are at serious risk. The extreme stress, fear, and dehumanization of incarceration in such a hostile environment can trigger psychological breakdowns in otherwise healthy individuals. Trauma becomes inevitable. Nightmares persist long after release. Many former inmates report post-traumatic stress, chronic anxiety, and deep depression as a result of their time there. 8. Calls for reform and closure expanded. For years, advocates, civil rights organizations, former inmates, and even political leaders have called for sweeping reforms, or the complete shutdown of Rikers Island. The facility has become a national symbol of everything that is broken within America's incarceration system. A place where human rights are violated daily, and where the concept of rehabilitation has been entirely abandoned. These calls for change have grown louder and more urgent with each tragic death, with each scandal, and with each heartbreaking story of someone who went to Rikers and never came out the same. Public pressure reached a peak after the death of Kalief Browder, sparking national outrage and renewed scrutiny of the jail's practices. Investigative reports from independent oversight boards and human rights groups have confirmed what insiders have long known, that the problems at Rikers are not temporary malfunctions, but permanent features of a deeply entrenched system of neglect and abuse. These findings have led to lawsuits, multi-million-dollar settlements, and widespread acknowledgement from city officials that Rikers is beyond repair. In 2017, then-Mayor Bill de Blasio and the New York City Council announced an ambitious plan to permanently close Rikers Island by the year 2026. The proposal includes replacing it with smaller, borough-based jails that are closer to courthouses, better integrated with community services, and built around principles of dignity, safety, and rehabilitation. While the announcement was a historic step, the road to implementation has been slow and riddled with political, logistical, and financial obstacles. Some critics worry that even with new facilities, the core issues, systemic racism, class inequality, and punitive philosophies, will simply be transferred from one location to another. Despite these concerns, the momentum behind the movement to close Rikers continues to build. Grassroots campaigns, led by formerly incarcerated individuals and community organizers, are pushing not just for closure, but for a total reimagining of what justice looks like. They advocate for decarceration, investments in mental health care, education, affordable housing, and alternatives to incarceration that truly serve the community. Rikers Island is more than a failing jail, it is a human rights crisis hiding in plain sight. Every cell, every solitary room, every broken spirit behind those bars is a testimony to a system that punishes the poor, forgets the vulnerable, and feeds on silence. But silence is complicity. The stories of suffering from Rikers aren't just headlines, they're cries for change, and they demand to be heard. We can no longer look away. Justice cannot exist in a place built on pain. Dignity cannot survive in darkness. It's time to stop patching a system that's beyond repair and start building one that values humanity, healing, and hope. Rikers Island must not just be reformed, it must be remembered, reckoned with, and finally, shut down. For good.